I get to do another welcome. Well, acknowledgement this time, so excuse me, I'm going to relish in the pleasure. Kaya Wanju. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I stand upon the land of my ancestors. So, Ya Nanya Jukin Nunis, Nan Elizabeth Jackson Barrett, Wajak Wajari Nunga Yoga, Nijabal Kuju, Nunok Karin, Karajini, Kurajinong, Balang Nunga Mort, were Nalan Ma, Karajidmo. Walibab. Balang Nunga Mort, were Nalan Ma, Nalakwakin Kura Kura Yeyi Boda Nitin, Nalak Durban Nunuk, Dinaning. So welcome to our presentation. We've come together today to learn, see and hear more about the Beeliar wetlands. Again, as we share our knowledges, our stories and learning, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country from the past, the present, the future. So Wanju, welcome. I'm going to introduce my colleagues behind me here. We've got Professor Mindy Blaze, who is originally from southern Louisiana and grew up in Texas. As a child and young adult, she spent her summers, shouldn't have played with that, sorry, spent her summers along the Mississippi River, where her grandmother shared stories about the Bayou Gula and taught her ways of listening. Mindy is an educational researcher in critical childhood studies with an interest in creative, speculative and feminist research methodologies for generating new pathways towards ethical worlds. We've got Professor Pierre Horwitz behind me again, who is a Wodjala in Wajak Nungabuja. His parents migrated from Switzerland in the 1950s. He lives in Wallialab and works in Joondalup and has spent most of his life on the south and west coast of the Australian continent with keen interest in Kep and Kau, learning from Karajan Buddhias and the social ecologies of inland aquatic systems. So I'm Libby Jackson Barrett. I'm a Noongar woman born in Wargle Kep, North Fremantle. My mother, Nunk Barbara, was born in Bicton, and her mother was Daisy Mary Jackson, born on Jalga Beeliar in the women's country of the Canning River, where her family were placed after they left New Norcia. So we're talking 1907. So what I do is I'm an educator, but Wallibup was my first on-country learning project where we brought children to the space and we used the space. It's an education space. It didn't have four walls. It's out there, and we had children coming from everywhere when we were using this space. So that's what I do, and we are all from Edith Cowan University. Keep going? Yes, okay. So this presentation is a methodological performance. In that, you will notice that we do not have a PowerPoint, and we have done that for a reason. So what we are wanting to do in our methodological performance, and more importantly, a presentation that's about having you, the audience, tuning into the yarn as a way to understand what we mean by re-enlivening wetlands. It's about dadidi, deep listening, to what is possible when we bring together performance and cultural knowledge alongside living spaces. The term dadidi comes from Auntie Miriam Rose Ungulmer, where she yarns about the deep inner spring inside us. To quote her, to know me is to breathe with me. To breathe with me is to listen deeply. To listen deeply is to connect. It's the sound of the deep calling, the calling from the deep inner spring within each of us. And that's from Auntie Rose's website. So it's about well-being. This place is a place of well-being. You mentioned that there's 40,000 years of archaeology sites. We've been here for 65,000 and some. So we have over here this beautiful stomping ground at Lake Kubala. We go further over and we've got a Nama hole that's situated at the hospital site at the lights. You go over further and you've got Piney Lakes for women and children. It's a place of learning. It always has been. So I would like to ask you, how many times have you walked or played in the rhythm of Wolleyabub? What do you see and what do you hear during this time when you walk the pathway, the biddy? What have you noticed in the flightless time of the Marley? What is occurring? What are the buoy signs out in the road to remind us about? This yarning session shares the knowledge and the way Aboriginal people value and use kep, water. To Noongars, kep is a vital aspect of life, whether it's kep from the Gubbi Karab, the fresh water, or the Beeliar, the river, or the Waram, the ocean. Kep is life. Yei Wakani, today we talk about the two chains of lakes that form part of the Beeliar Wetlands, a long time place, a place of the knitting, the cold times, creation, dreaming, where they were created by the Waggle who came from Jurabolak, the northeast, down past York and the Avon, creating the lakes and the Namaholes with the rhythm of its body, the lakes running parallel to the Jundal, the coast, or Murawak on the west, the most western aspect. And they are Gabakanin saltwater, while the lakes on the Boyalak on the east side are places of Gabikika freshwater. Both are living spaces. So what is your relatedness to Wolleyabub?
My story is about the word common. We've already heard it once. And at this point, I actually want to ask you a hypothetical question. Do you think wetlands are common or shared by us all? Should they be? Perhaps while you're thinking of that question, I'd like to draw some distinctions around the word commons. In doing so, it's actually a crazy mix of law, philosophy, history, environmental management, economics. It's a pretty good sustainability topic, really. So I'll start with common law. As you know, I'm not a lawyer, but common law is commonly understood as case law. It's a body of unwritten laws based on legal precedents established by the courts. Common law draws from institutionalised opinions and interpretations from judges and juries, as an example. Common law influences the decision-making processes in unusual cases where they need to be converted to law or statutes. Common law is also practiced in US, United States, Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, India, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Do you recognise these countries? Common law system evolved from a British tradition that's spread during the 17th and the 18th century, colonial period. Common law in the Commonwealth is a colonial artefact. This doesn't help us answer the question, are wetlands common or shared by us all, except that wetlands are subject to common law like everything else, it seems. When we talk about commons, maybe that takes us a little bit closer. Here we're referring to an economic construct designed for natural resources. So this might be more directly relevant to the hypothetical question. Originally, it's from medieval England, where the common was legally part of an estate owned by the lord of the manor, but over which certain classes of tenants were allowed certain rights. And by extension, the term commons has come to be applied to other resources which a community has rights or access to. And the modern usage of commons is to refer to particular rights of common and to reserve the name common for the land, or in our case, the wetland, over which the rights are exercised. And a person who has the right in or over common land jointly with others is called a commoner. So is Wolleyabub commons. We argue, sort of. but not really, on two grounds. Firstly, wetlands occur here in a system where exclusion and property, in other words, ownership criteria, are dictated by the state. And secondly, even though we might have access or rights to wetlands, they're subject to regulation because the way our governance system operates to prevent something like the tragedy of the commons, where one person takes more than their fair share to the detriment of everyone else, is for the state to intervene with a heavy hand and to constrain individuals' behaviour by regulation like permits and licences, to say where commons exist. And they say things like you can only take so much water and you can only take so much fish or only take so much soil or do particular things with them, and then to apply a penalty if they don't abide or if you don't abide. So it doesn't really apply to our situation. Or if it does, it says, well, we're not really, the commons really aren't, the wetlands aren't really commons. They're not really ours. There's another form of commons that I want to introduce to you that you all know about, I'm sure, and that belongs to a legal tradition used by Indigenous people the world over. Patrick Glenn calls this chthonic law. Sometimes it's called Indigenous law, sometimes it's called first law, but it's a remarkable commonality across all Indigenous systems. It's the legal system belongs to a worldview that where there is a sense of rootedness in nature, in tradition, and a commitment to maintaining balance and harmony to it. That commitment is the glue, if you like, with symbiotic relationships and where country is held in common. We started to hear about this yesterday. The extension is that country is indivisible. And the health of the country reflects the health of the people, vice versa. Private property doesn't exist in this system. Wetlands, in our case, have an entirely different importance in chthonic legal systems than in Western systems because the spirit of one's ancestor is fused with the soil and thus belongs to one's ancestors and to future generations as much, if not more, than the ones that are here. So land or wetlands is much more than property. It's another actor in society. And there's no formal concept of property or ownership of a wetland. Those alive are merely stewards of a land while they're on this earth. And before they return to the earth, and they have responsibility. It's the responsibility. Part of that glue is the responsibility for its care and its condition. If you need to make decisions about it, then those decisions are made regarding the wetland, or usually done so with a council of elders or such like. So the major characteristic in terms of commons, in terms of the chthonic worldview, is that a wetland is regarded as belonging not to an individual, but to the whole social group. Dare we dream?
So let's talk a little bit about wetland relationality. Wetland policy is complicated by and dominated by colonial and Western viewpoints that prioritize the relationships between abiotic and biotic components of ecosystems and manage them according to sets of values and principles built around resource extraction. Scientific interpretations of wetlands use technical and mechanistic ways of acquiring knowledge, and these forms of understandings are harnessed to the same type of economic and philosophical reasoning that accepts that resources can and should be extracted. The rationale extends to measuring environmental impacts in the same way, with mixed success in terms of the sustainability of wetland ecosystems. Part of its failure is the denial of other forms of relationships that exist between people and wetland ecosystems. The conceptually simplest of these other relationships in wetland ecosystems in scientific terms is that the flow of materials, water, nutrients, ions, in and out of wetland components and subsystems, they are made of the same constituents. Other forms of relationships take us to much more interesting places. A foundational one is that people are part of ecosystems, not apart from them. This includes perspectives that recognize the interdependence and reciprocity between wetlands and people. These properties show that we are dealing with systems, not simple linear relationships. Interdependence and reciprocity are often best expressed as narratives or stories. Considering stories as complementary and supplementary ways of knowing wetland ecosystems acknowledges embedded, lived, place-based, and time-honored experiences and expectations of local communities.
So once story is accepted as legitimate knowledge, other forms of relationality emerge. When personal and community stories depict wetlands or their components as totems and as kin, as in Indigenous cultures, responsibilities for them are evident and expressed, and carrying familiar or equivalent obligations and prescribed appropriate behaviours and actions, more sharing and caring, less possessing and extracting. When people feel so connected to home and land, to Budja, to country, and Budja is responsive and has a voice and stories and has evidence of creation and a spirit and a memory of past events, colonial and scientific distinctions between abiotic and biotic, living and non-living, dissolve or at least are nonsensical. As prominent Noongar elder Uncle Cedric Jacob who has since passed, refers to the Waggle, and it is Waggle, not Woggle, it is Waggle. And I'm quoting verbatim from Yalakitch there. A snake or rainbow serpent recognised by Noongar as the giver of life, as maintaining all freshwater sources, describing it in this way. It is through the lake system. There is a water serpent down there below, which is extremely important, and the water on the surface is really the marks where the Waggle wither and wind his way through and came up after making the streams and the waterways. It's all part of the ecological system to purify the land and the family. Once it was surrounded by waterways, and if they fill them up with rubbish, then the land begins to die and the people become sick. Together, these forms of relationality demand a different logic for how we set wetland policy. Parks 2022 provided an application of the relationalities when contemplating the voice of a wetland, in this case the Beeliar, the river, and then the Beeliar conversations one might have. In doing so, she referred to the rivers as eco-social elders, with a posture of humility from whom unlearning and relearning about the nature of being occurred. Her perspective is respectful, storied and critical, guiding principles for policy.
So I'd like to share a story from the research project Walking with Beeliar, which is part of a collaborative international consortium known as the Climate Action Network. This project set out to generate knowledge on children's responses to climate change. It used a common world's theoretical framing that moves beyond the human-centric concerns of mid-20th century human development theory that is dominant in education, to recognize instead the complexities of human-environment relations and ecological challenges and concerns. It positions childhoods as collective, situated, and entangled within messy, real-world and everyday relations. Walking with Beeliar was a year-long project that involved researchers, teachers, and a small group of preschool children walking with Beeliar to generate climate change pedagogies that center human-environment relations rather than individual children's needs. Typically, education tends to focus on the child and what she needs to learn, rather than the relations and more than human communities children are already a part of, and how these relations and communities might inform climate change pedagogies now. One of the aims of the project was to work with teachers to help them shift from always teaching children about the world towards recognizing the lively worlds children are already a part of. The use of a situated, emerging, and responsive walking methodology also helped to disrupt how sustainability education teaches children about the world so they can act upon it, towards learning to become with worlds in which they are enmeshed. After 3 months of walking with Derbyl Yerrigan and experimenting with practices informed by Indigenous knowledge systems, we began noticing how Beeliar was making connections and relations with us. On previous walks, children's noticings and talk involved what they could see on top of Derbyl Yerrigan. So on this walk, we were interested to shift the focus from seeing what was on top to sensing and listening to what was happening underneath Beeliar, to us and with us. Based on observational field notes and video recordings of walking with Derbyl Yerrigan, combined with writing creatively, experimentally, and speculatively, I invite you to listen to the following Beeliar story and to consider how Beeliar and children are in relation, becoming together, and the kinds of worlds that are in the making. Wading through Derbyl Yerrigan with Olivia and Katie, we take our time stepping gently over thousands of small river shells while also watching out for moon jellies and blowfish. Beeliar is calm and greets us by gently rolling and swirling around our shins, ankles, and feet. Her coolness touches our skin. With Beeliar gently swirling around us, I use both hands to take a small pair of light pink baby-sized tights, affectionately called baby legs, and pull the waistband wide, making a large round hole. With both girls watching, I push this do-it-yourself device further below Derbyl Yerrigan's surface, trawling back and forth, back and forth. Slowly and together, we bring the tights back up. With anticipation, we find bits of brown and green rivergrass stuck in it. We do this repeatedly, over and over again, swirling and moving with Beeliar. Suddenly, Katie stops, and with closed eyes, she crouches down low and smiles as Beeliar continues gently moving around her. Olivia begins stomping her feet, churning up sand, shells, rivergrass, water, and more. Looking up towards the sky, she points and says, "Like Jarankara." Churning, turning, and mixing continues. Together we churn, turn, and mix. We wonder how Beeliar movements bring plants and marine life closer to us, closer to Molly and to Jarankara. Beeliar is turning milky yellow-brown, and suddenly Katie stops. Quietly, Beeliar settles, and we feel Beeliar's touch and coolness on our legs, hands, arms, and shoulders. While bending low and sitting in and with Derbyl Yerrigan, we wonder, how does Beeliar feel today? And Katie replies, nice, very, and a little bit scratchy. We were learning together with Beeliar, and this involved centering Indigenous knowledge systems that recognize worlds as holistic, interdependent, connected, agentic, and entangled. These knowledge systems influenced how we were practicing deep listening, dialoguing, and resituating ourselves with Beeliar worlds and coming to know Beeliar worlds as ethical. The pedagogical doings in this project are multiple and informed again by Indigenous knowledge systems. We were not just thinking about Beeliar, we were walking with, thinking with, and becoming with this river. Rather than walking to a destination or a spot on a map, walking with is being open to what becomes evident to us on the day and then how we respond. Our responses are embodied, emerging, sensorial, and collective. They are with Beeliar. These doings, including movements, mixings, and swirlings, are more than human, and they help us to focus on how Derbyl Yerrigan is making connections and bringing worlds together. Recognizing and then storying the agency and liveliness of durable Yerrigan is important because it's one of the ways we can begin to shift our understandings of Beeliar from an object to manage and control and to know about to a subject. And as a subject, Beeliar has the capacity to respond. And it's these responses that are worth paying attention to.
As if we needed to be convinced again. Walking with acknowledges that wetlands have agency. In fact, actually recognising that a hill or a mountain or ocean or soil has agency, that acknowledgement confronts a worldview that differentiates nature from culture. It confronts that. Where nature's reducible to its component parts and reassembled as if it's some sort of machine, and worse, to perform some sort of function for us. The same worldview separates the living and the non-living in a system, instead of seeing the whole as a living system. This is another example of a sort of dichotomous assumptions that structure the way that we think about our relationships with the world. In our penultimate act, I'm here to convince you that the way that a scientist thinks can be used to regard wetlands as living systems. To a biologist, of course, wetlands are living because they contain living things, from microbes, viruses, archaea, bacteria, fungi in particular, to microinvertebrates, to the riparian, the aquatic plants, the macroinvertebrates, the vertebrates that are found in these habitats. For them, this recognition is important, very important, but it's insufficient. And it's insufficient even to add the complex symbiotic relationships that exist between all of those biological components. A biologist would ask more about what it is to be alive and to have agency. Can wetlands evolve? Can they reproduce? Do they have a hereditary system? A hereditary system that exhibits variability? Are wetlands bounded physical entities that are separated from but in communication with their environments? And are wetlands informational? Do they have their own information and their own metabolism? And are they coordinated and regulated themselves? And do they respond? Do wetlands conform to all of these criteria? I think they do. Firstly, wetlands have the same genetic material: wind, water, sand, and rocks. You have to bend your mind a little bit. Wetlands form wherever water flows. Wetlands can be replicated. They are replicated. They're replicated across the landscape. The Seminyoks recognised that when they called them consanguineous suites, consanguineous, of the same blood. So geomorphologists recognised that. Wetlands are bounded according to the shape of the land. They've got semi-permeable and selective boundaries. And within the wetland, the biological, the mineral, the physical, the chemical features are all entwined, and they all affect one another. Again, suggesting internal regulation. Soils and sediments evolve, and they grow, and they erode, and they deposit. They're produced from perpetual interaction with water, vegetation, geology, and climate, and so on, and with microbes that develop particular characteristics that vary locally. Together, these complex interactions are the information that's within wetlands and that contributes to what wetlands are capable of doing. They give wetlands a foundational purpose, and that's to process water and sediment. And they have a memory. Wetlands remember. Their depth and shape profile is a perfect response to what they've received in the past. And they have a memory of seasonal, yearly, decadal, centennial, millennial events even. Wind and rain events that need to be processed. In this sense, wetlands are long-time places. They're here forever. So wetlands respond to and they modify their surroundings and conditions, and they're self-organised. They organise themselves. They've got emergent properties. They know when they're healthy and they're unhealthy. A wetland is a living system with component parts that are interdependent and connected. Gravity, water, carbon, nutrients, other elements link them. Humans aren't exempt from that. They're part of these living systems. Actually, wetlands are also embodied and enlivened, as Mindy's just explained to us. Spiritual entities create and continue to exist in life forms and landforms. Wetlands have a spirit as well. Yeah.
So in concluding, we have sustainable wetlands when we relearn about wetlands, kudjul jinini, two-way. Wetlands is two-way seeing, or kudjul kadajin, two-way knowledge. Wetlands is common, wetland relations, wetland wakani, story. Wetland with agency, genderbedi wakani, walking and talking with wetlands. Wetlands is living. So maybe some of the questions we pose to you, the audience, what rights do you think wetlands have? Yep. And that is the end of our presentation, Prof.
We've actually got a series of questions that we'd like to ask you, and if we could maybe take over, if you're happy with that, 10 minutes,
Sure.
Okay. So one of them is to start with this, with as Libby has just mentioned, what rights do you think wetlands have, and what rights do you think they should have?
I had a question I wanted to ask you, which is sort of my answer to your question, which is why don't wetlands in Australia have the same rights as rivers and wetlands in New Zealand? I mean, they have legal rights. Why don't we?
One word, treaty.
Yeah. So that's my answer to your question, sort of. And they should.
So Catherine's saying that the wetlands should have rights, and there are legal precedents for this in some parts of the world with rivers, with mountains. Yes, please.
Just a simple answer. Just a simple answer to that would be just to wetlands have the right to be healthy, to be non-polluting, and to have the respect that any other person would receive, as you would respect your own backyard.
I was just going to say the simple rights of nature and the whole natural ecosystem. They're part of the whole natural ecosystem, and nature out there has incredible rights, yes.
Steve, and then there's one.
Yeah, wetlands have the rights not to be tortured. Well, I know that when I think about individual rights, I always balance them with individual responsibilities. We as individuals have rights, but we also have responsibilities. So if we were to think the same for wetlands, what responsibilities do we attribute to them? We attribute to them the responsibility to, filter water for us. Well, they should have rights that match that responsibility. So they should have rights to, have their water catchments managed, their water inputs, treated as an entitlement to those wetlands. And I think you could use the same logic to identify a whole suite of rights that wetlands should have. Yes.
Somebody here?
Wetlands have the right to persist. Wetlands have the right to persist. They're one of the oldest parts of our landscape.
and their right to be there for future generations and beyond us. That's a fundamental right of what they are, I feel. Yeah.
Hi, Pierre. Hi, everybody up there. I was going to say that's kind of like, I don't know really any legal structure that gives nature the same equivalence as human rights or human use of it. We have to break out of our 300, 400-year-old legal circle, so to speak, to be able to go back to chthonic kind of rights and so on. So I'd break it up. I tend to be more linear about looking at this. And the point is to encourage cultural shift, to embrace, you might say, chthonic love over to the legal construct. And I know that sounds terribly academic, but all of us are converted here, basically. So we don't have a problem with that. And yeah, many of us might give equivalence to a lot of beautiful natural things like wetlands, but we don't have the legal ability to do that yet through common law or precedence in law, no matter the hierarchy of law. So I guess what I'm saying is it's an excellent question. And yes, we need to give wetlands the equivalence and the protections against all the abuse. But really, we are but in the beginning of the journey. I hope climate change accelerates our quick adoption, and then we're able to somehow keep some wetlands going in that climate face of change. Sorry to be so poetic. My apologies, and thank you.
Amazing talk. Thank you so much, all of you. Wetlands need the right to evolve. With climate change and our wetlands drying, we need to be able to have them evolve to what they would become, a Banksy woodland. Our wetlands have evolved over time. They naturally fill because they are at the bottom of a catchment and they receive material that fills them over time and they evolve into another being. And in other parts, erosion will create new areas where wetlands can form. But we say no. We say the wetland is here. This is the line. The river needs to move. The river needs to flood. The river needs to do the things it needs to be alive, because if it can't be a river.
Thank you. That's truly awesome. I'm listening to our responses to your question, and it's clear that we're all coming from a human rights kind of perspective. Okay, we have these rights, so we will kind of generously grant them to wetlands, whatever. Strikes me that there's something a little bit arrogant about that. These natural beings are way bigger than we are. They're way prior. They've been here way longer than we have. So I'm groping for what rights. There's no language, I guess, that I have at this point for where we're trying to go with this.
I can only approach this idea of rights from something that one of my fellow students said when I was studying. And her comment was, we are thinking in a Christian way of our environment. We were taught that the nature is a construct given to us to boss around as we see fit, because we are the top of the heap, so to speak. Until we learn that we are part of a whole rather than the ruler of the whole, I don't see how we can approach it in a balanced fashion. I think until we accept how we think and why we think, we won't be able to change the way we think.
It's always been my understanding from when I went to TAFE 100 years ago that Aboriginal people had the control over whether any wetland, creek or whatever was to be developed in any way. And that was supposedly told me that was part of the law, that they had to be consulted before anything that happened to a wetland was enabled. But obviously that has not been the case. So I just wonder where that information would have come from if it was, 30 years ago?
Well, 30 years ago, it was probably common nonsense rather than common sense. And yes, we are getting better at working alongside Aboriginal peoples, but not in the way that we should. Quite often it's after the event when wheels are already set in motion. And I think, we've got a collective story. So we need to be walking side by side. So it's both knowing that we have to work with and know about spaces and places. So, but that's not always been the case, no.
Einstein said that we can't use the same means to solve our problems that got us into where we are with the wetlands. We've been told how many of our wetlands have been lost from the landscape, and that is true. And so part of the problem, I think, in where we are today is that the planning process is very much guided by a set of dollars that are placed on the value of land and the ownership of that land, and profits that can be gained from extracting resources and developing developments that provide profits. The problem is that we cannot, or it's very difficult to put dollar terms on the ecosystem services that these wetlands provide to us, and the traditional knowledge of the connection between humans and all the other animal species and wildlife that use wetlands has been lost, and very difficult to say that this is worth a certain value in the planning process. So yes, we need alternatives, and I congratulate you on your presentation, all the wonderful ideas you've presented to us today. And I think having rights for wetlands is a way forward, that we can start to bring balance to the decisions that are made in our planning processes.
Thank you.
Look, there's no Bill of Rights for us as individuals, and so we don't have any, a Bill of Rights legally that we can defend. And wetlands have no rights. That they exist because we come together collectively and fight the developers that want to develop them. Rights for wetlands is a bit ethereal. They often only exist because we fight for them.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. It seems to me this has been a great conversation too, and we're really talking about how the rights can be brought into a Western legal system, but this has happened for corporations, where corporations have been recognised as having their own rights, and we can see this through, I think, in New Zealand, for instance, the river has been recognised as a legal person, I think. And I quite like the term I've come across as kind of ancestral personhood, really. But I think that comes to that point of the wetland having a history, having a memory, and I also like that idea of, well, if there are responsibilities for wetlands, then there should be rights for wetlands. And I think there is a power in using the Western legal system to be able to take up, sue, or bring to the attention of people through the courts or other ways the rights of a wetland. And we can see this is happening in New Zealand too, where the river is suing people, or the custodians on behalf of the river are suing the state for the rights of that ancestral person. So yeah, but I do think it is really about how do we bring these things into a Western legal system in a way that's really effective.
Thank you, the three of you, for the presentation. It was so beautiful, so poetic, and so able to sort of expand through a lot of the sentiments and implications of our relationship with the wetlands. I felt particularly connected with aspect related with education of children. Having a 2.5-year-old, I can so relate with what you said, and I see my child at 2.5 relating with the river. Just would like to say that, just following on Todd, what Todd said, I really look up for those First Nations professionals working in law, working in science, that are indeed using what Gail mentioned yesterday. Okay, let's play football, let's play the rules, and they drive through the system, through those rules to make the point about those legal rights. You know, the treaty is one case, you know, we all hope it will get through. And there's Indigenous First Nation lawyers all over the country that are really pushing for the rights of water. You know, the Murray-Darling system is one case. And these people are brilliant because they know the system, but they have the whole cultural background from the other system. And I think that's wonderful. And I think we really need to support them. And maybe our professions are there to support them where we can, you know, to empower their voice really and help them in our local knowledge so that they can navigate that system through into giving the power and law to rights to nature and water.
Thank you. I'll stand up because I'm way up at the back. So yeah, thanks. That was a really inspiring talk. Just occurred to me, isn't this all a little bit ironic that we somehow think we're in a position to be assigning rights to nature? We're all sitting here with masks on, feeling a little bit uncomfortable. I can't see where I'm going because my glasses keep fogging up. And that's all because of a little quirk of nature that happened. I'm medically trained, but I've worked in conservation for a long time. Viruses are nature too. They're just part of the system. And this probably isn't a very helpful comment. What I'm getting to is that we really need to get back, as many people here have said, to this idea that we are part of the system. We're in the system. We can't just say, hey, you wetland, do what we want, or, you know, we've got to get that feeling of being a part of it. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. So, Yanka, thank you for listening.
You can stay up there for a minute. First of all, Professor Blaze, my apologies. But look, that was excellent. In many ways, it was probably one of the best threesome presentations I've ever heard. It flowed very nicely, and there was a lot in that. And thank you for also not putting up a PowerPoint in many ways. It was excellent. And we look forward to this continued relationship. There is an international draft of wetland rights. It certainly has been floated around in the East, and we as a board, we as a board, we're thinking about even bringing that to this conference. We certainly will at one of the next conferences to look at the rights of wetlands. And it's an interesting document, and there's a lot of good things in there, but also I don't think it gives enough recognition to the power of the First Nations. But thank you very much. It was great.